smell what the Rock is cooking?
WWF Royal Rumble was an arcade game that ran on Sega's Naomi hardware. The game was brought to the arcades in early 2000 and then ported over to the Dreamcast in August that same year in the United States. The game was developed by Ukes, the same guys who brought us the SmackDown games, and THQ published the Dreamcast version while Sega distributed the arcade version. For comparison, SmackDown 2 Know Your Role was released just a few months after WWF Royal Rumble on the Dreamcast, so that should give you an idea of where WWF games stood at the time in regards to how they looked and how they played. Royal Rumble turns out to be quite an oddity when looking at the history of WWF and WWE games, so let's jump in and we'll see how this one came together. The Sega Naomi standing for New Arcade Operation Machine Idea, was an arcade system released by Sega in 1998, being the successor to the Sega Model 3 hardware. The Model 3 ran games such as Virtua Fighter 3, Daytona USA 2, and Kane's favourite game, Sega Rally 2. The Model 3 was an impressive 3D system for the late 90s, but the Naomi was going to be even better, and Sega done a little forward thinking this time around. The Sega Dreamcast would release for the home market around the same time as Naomi machines were showing up in arcades. The Naomi had twice as much system and graphics memory and a faster graphics processor, but seeing as the Naomi hardware shared the same basic system architecture as the Dreamcast, porting arcade games for the home console was a pretty easy task with only minor caveats being made. Basically, the Sega Dreamcast would let users play almost arcade-perfect versions of their favourite games. Games like House of the Dead 2, Crazy Taxi and Virtua Tennis got Dreamcast ports that saved gamers from having to travel to arcades, and quite a lot of those home ports got new modes for the home market. Some games would even let players bring their Dreamcast VMU to the arcades to send and receive data, unlocking characters or earning you more in-game currency to bring back to your home game, things like that. WWF Royal Rumble though added nothing when it got released on Dreamcast. The short time it took to port the game over should tell us all we need to know really. Basically, the arcade version looks ever so slightly better while the Dreamcast version has an options mode with a very basic amount of options available. So what Dreamcast owners got when they purchased Royal Rumble was an arcade game through and through, and boy, it shows. An arcade game's made to take your hard-earned cash, and in return you'll get a generally fast and quick experience in hopes that you'll pump in more coins, and that experience was carried over to the Dreamcast version of Royal Rumble. I should mention too though that this wasn't the first WWF game to get ported over in this fashion. The home versions of WrestleMania the arcade game didn't add anything new either in terms of the single player experience. Every home port of WrestleMania is also inferior to the arcade version in one way or the other, so at least with Royal Rumble you get the complete arcade experience thanks to the similarities shared between Naomi and Dreamcast, for better or for worse. Check this out though, here's Guru Larry's copy of WWF Royal Rumble for the Sega Naomi. That's pretty cool. For the sake of convenience, we're going to look at the Dreamcast version in today's video, and I'm sure this is the version most people played. Boot up the game and an intro video plays showing us clips from the Royal Rumble 2000 pay-per-view event. They show off wrestlers who aren't in the game here though. Here's the main menu, and yep, it's extremely limited. You have to remember that this is an arcade game. I'm going to leave all the options as default, seeing as we want to play this the way it was intended to be played at a cabinet, but you can toggle the difficulty here and turn off interference, which wouldn't have been available in arcades unless you messed around with dip switches. We have two modes available, your standard arcade tournament mode where you wrestle one guy after another, and there's also the Royal Rumble mode. You can also play up to 4-player exhibition modes if you can convince a bunch of poor bastards to sit down with you to play this game. Here's the roster, and we have 19 superstars to choose from, 21 if we include the unlockable Vince and Shane McMahon. Kurt Angle and Taz made their WWF game debut here, and we've also got The Big Show. If you remember back to the Know Your Role review, you'd remember that Show got removed from that game as he was sent to OVW. Also, check out the countdown timer, this was also found in the mode select. Hurry up and make your choices or the game will choose for you. Again, it's an arcade game. Once you select your superstar, you'll need to pick someone to stand in your corner, and this is a fundamental part of the game. Your corner man's going to play a big part in every match because you'll have the ability to call them into the ring without the risk of disqualification. You're going to pick a set of moves your corner man can perform in the match, but I'll explain all this in a moment. Let's set up a 2-player game and I'll show you how to play this thing. WWF Royal Rumble has a stripped down control scheme. In the arcades only 3 buttons were used, but the Dreamcast utilises the trigger buttons for finishers and taunts. Still, you're only going to use 3 face buttons to do practically everything else. The A button performs all strikes, the B button's your grapple button and the button to pick up weapons, and the X button does everything else, countering, blocking, running, pinning, climbing the turnbuckles, all that stuff. If we look at the heads up display, we'll see 3 meters. The top one is your energy bar, and I don't need to explain that. The middle one is your special meter, but you need to fill this up 3 times to perform your main finisher. Every time you fill the meter up, you'll see the letter S, and you can stockpile these up and use them for quick counters, quick pin escapes, and the meter can also be used to get you off the apron during a Royal Rumble match. We'll look at the Royal Rumble a bit later on though. But all you really need to know is if you want to perform your finisher, you need to get 3 S's. The bottom meter is your partner interference bar, and the Type A, Type B, Type C represent your partner's moveset that you selected at the player select screen. Pressing A plus B, B plus X, or X plus A will bring your corner man into the ring and they'll perform the corresponding move. Once the move's been performed, you won't be able to do it again for a certain amount of time. As you can probably guess then, the singles matches in Royal Rumble are absolutely chaotic with guys running in and performing moves, but it gets even more crazier than that. At random times, the lights go out in the arena and you'll get teleported to a backstage area, or maybe a cage will surround the ring. You can turn this option off in the Dreamcast version, but in the arcades you had to deal with it. Interference is also frequent. Superstars will run down to the ring and try to deal damage, and it happens all the time. You can't select cage matches, you can't even select tag team matches. Singles matches in Royal Rumbles are all that's on offer here, though the singles matches are no disqualification too. There's around 80 weapons in the game and they can dent and break, a first for WWF games at the time. The game feels like a more frantic version of SmackDown 2 Know Your Role, and that's maybe hard to imagine seeing as that game was already very fast paced. But they tried to simplify things here to make players pump in more coins into the arcade machine, and they wanted the whole match experience over as quickly as possible. So how does it feel to play the game, and how enjoyable is the normal one-on-one experience in WWF Royal Rumble? It's absolute fucking chaos. Players who enjoy strategizing a match and those who like to try and emulate what a real wrestling match plays out like will be sorely disappointed with Royal Rumble. This game just throws shit at you and it encourages you to button mash like crazy. Everything just happens so quickly, even the entrances are just seconds long. An issue I had too was the game's lack of a focus or lock-on button. Sometimes I would grapple away from my opponent because I wasn't looking directly at them, and when the ring starts filling up with wrestlers, it can become a problem. With interference happening all the time, the corner men dashing in to perform moves, the special meters getting filled up extremely quickly, and the possibility of teleportation, the matches you play in Royal Rumble feel overwhelming and really not much fun in comparison to SmackDown 2 Know Your Role. It's pretty easy to win matches too. I'm playing on the default setting and I'm assuming the arcade cabinet was set to the hard difficulty by default, but even with all the chaos going on, it's still pretty easy to pick up a victory. That is, until you get to Vince or Shane McMahon in the final match. Old Vince may be paying top dollar to keep women hush hush, but in this game he's a cheap old bastard who counters everything. It feels like there's some input reading going on here because our final boss knows exactly what I'm going to do every time I go to do it. As an arcade game though, something that you have a quick play at then walk away onto something else, I guess it wouldn't be too bad, and it's quite fascinating that a 3D WWF game like this even got released in arcades in the first place, but as something you'd pay for to bring home and enjoy as a console game, it's just not up to scratch at all. I will say this though, it looks really good for its time. Compared to the PS1 games, the character models look good, and the Royal Rumble entranceway, lights and crowd also looks good, even though it's based on the 1999 Royal Rumble. Superstar attires are accurate and more detailed than SmackDown 2. Faces look a lot better too, even though some are still pretty funny to look at. But in comparison to everything else that was on the market at the time, Royal Rumble did impress with its graphics. The gameplay isn't good though, and everything else about the game game is really limited, from the roster to the game modes available. Seriously, you could see everything the game has to offer in around half an hour. There is a little variety in the backstage areas and weapons, I guess, but most of those are simply cosmetic and it's not something you're going to care all that much about. The standard arcade mode gets boring and you want to choose someone else halfway through. The surprise of moving the action to a backstage area gets old really fast, and your reward for completing the arcade mode is Vince McMahon. I'm not sure if everyone would have been happy with that. Alright, the Royal Rumble mode, the game's namesake. Surely we're going to see improvements here, and this should be the best Royal Rumble mode available in any game up to this point. First problem, there isn't enough superstars for a 30-man Royal Rumble. I mean, I don't like to overanalyze things like this, but don't you think someone would have even suggested that more wrestlers should have been added to the game? What we get instead are wrestlers entering the Royal Rumble multiple times, and we also get alternate attires, and boy did they ever get lazy with those alternate attires. Mankind, for example, one version has a tie and another doesn't. No Cactus Jack, no Dude Love, they just removed his tie. So, forgetting all that, this really is not your standard Royal Rumble game mode. Let me explain. You start the match with 3 minutes on the clock. There aren't 30 superstars entering the Royal Rumble, but it's your job to eliminate 30 superstars, so there could be way more than 30 entrants. If the CPU eliminates someone, it doesn't matter, the match will continue on until you've eliminated 30 superstars. The clock always ticks down, and to get extra time on the clock, you must eliminate opponents. You'll get 20 seconds added to the timer for each elimination. You get 40 seconds for eliminating a super wrestler. There'll be one super wrestler in every Royal Rumble match, and if you get eliminated, you'll have the option to join the Rumble again. In the arcades, this would have cost an extra credit, of course. The gameplay itself is modified for the Royal Rumble, with competitors easily getting tied up in the ropes, and superstars will hang on from the apron, trying their best to stay in the Rumble match. And with the amount of characters on screen at one time, it again gets extremely chaotic, yet it actually isn't too bad to play. Because you aren't having a traditional wrestling match here and you're just trying to dump guys over the top rope, the ridiculous breakneck speed of the game actually becomes beneficial. You'll be able to eliminate guys quite quickly, and as something that you'd play in the arcade, really, this wouldn't be all that bad. This mode is way more suited to the arcades in comparison to the usual one-on-one matches. 9 competitors can be inside the ring at the same time, and that's quite the accomplishment. There's also no load times in between entrants, and to give them credit, the game will rotate wrestlers to try and ensure you don't get the same superstar in the ring twice at the same time. Adding time to the clock reminds me of other Sega arcade games like Crazy Taxi and 18 Wheeler. It is another gimmick to try to get players to put more coins in the cabinet though, and Crazy Taxi definitely felt more like a fun challenge in its arcade mode. Royal Rumble's timer feels more like an annoyance. All in all though, I don't hate the Royal Rumble mode in this game. It's not like any other Royal Rumble I've ever played, and while the gameplay itself is still absolutely insane, it's not as awful as you may think. I can also see why there's no lock-on button after playing this mode though. Imagine trying to cycle through all these wrestlers when trying to focus on just one guy. It would have been an absolute nightmare. And the autofocus works a lot better in Royal Rumble mode than what it does in exhibitions. The difficulty ramps up with the more guys you eliminate too, so there's a bit of challenge here. Again, I'm just playing on the default difficulty, but when it comes down to the final 10 men or so, it does get pretty hard. It's very hard to recommend Royal Rumble because it's so thin in terms of content, and what is here really isn't suited for a home console. If you walk past it in an arcade, it would maybe hold your attention for 10 minutes or so, and I guess that's what the game was originally intended to do. It had the potential to rope people in and munch through a few credits, but even then, I couldn't imagine people spending a ton of money while playing this. It's quite a jarring game when you play your first match, and it does take a few matches before you know what you're doing though. I'd be interested to hear from people who played the arcade machine because I've never laid eyes on it. Arcades around my area were dying down big time when Royal Rumble got released, and any arcades or amusement centres that were open didn't have a Royal Rumble cabinet. I think though that WrestleMania the arcade game blows Royal Rumble out of the water in terms of a quick pick up and play wrestling video game that deviates from the norm. It feels like there's way more control in WrestleMania, whereas sometimes in Royal Rumble you're just kind of throwing yourself into a bunch of opponents and hoping for the best. Others would point to WrestleFest as the king of wrestling arcade games, and while I won't begin discussions around WrestleMania versus WrestleFest, I will say that that both are way more fun to play than Royal Rumble, for me anyway. Royal Rumble was always going to be a tough sell in 2000, with the PlayStation 1 SmackDown game doing well and the promise of a sequel that same year, and with No Mercy for Nintendo 64 coming out in 2000, it was going to be difficult to pull players away from their home consoles to visit the arcades, especially for a wrestling game. And as for the Dreamcast, WWF Royal Rumble wasn't a good enough game to make wrestling fans pick up Sega's console for their wrestling fix either. This wasn't exclusive to wrestling games though. Home consoles were getting better and the experiences available in the comfort of your own home were surpassing those available in the arcades. As mentioned, it is quite fascinating that a WWF game got released in 2000 that used Duke's wrestling engine, and it's interesting to see how they modified the engine to better suit an arcade cabinet, but the final product isn't all that good and you should be in absolutely no rush to pick this one up. Give it a go on an emulator and try a Royal Rumble match. After that, you can pretty much forget that the game even exists, just like everyone else. Thanks for watching guys, and take care.
Do you smell what The Rock is cooking? The Rock says